In this tutorial, we're going to be using LuxCore as our render engine. It does not come standard in Blender, so if you don't already have it, head over to luxcorerender.org to download and install it. The reason why we're using LuxCore is that it has a special feature called the Photon GI cache, which allows us to calculate caustics realistically. Cycles at the time of this recording does not have the same feature. In the description of this video, I've included a link to this starter file. And the starter file is just a lazily modeled pool which will hold the water that we're about to make. Aside from that, the settings are all set to defaults so that if you decide not to use this model, you can still follow along the tutorial. With all of that said, let's get started. So I have the starter file open here. Let's just take a look at what it looks like in rendered view. So it looks like it came with this default sky texture in the world settings here, but that's not the type of lighting that I want for the scene. The way that I'm going to light the scene is with an HDRI. Before I can do that, I have to go and download one. So I'm going to head over to hdrihaven.com, and I'm going to go into the high contrast category. One of the necessary elements in creating pool caustics is having a bright, small light source, like a sun. If you have something like a large area lamp over pool water, it's probably not going to give you the caustics that you're looking for. So I'm going to download this one here, the Abandoned Hopper Terminal 4 at 4K resolution. Okay, so once you have downloaded that HDRI, let's go back to Blender and let's enable it. So right now we have sky selected. Let's select HDRI, and under the HDRI settings, let's hit this open button and select the HDR that you just downloaded. I'm going to open that up. So the HDRI was applied. You see the lighting change. You see the environment around reflects the image that we just downloaded. And this will be a good basis for lighting our scene. So at this point, all we have to do now is add water. And the way that I'm going to do that is using the ocean modifier. So I'm just going to start off by adding a plane using Shift-A, Mesh, Plane. And we have a plane here. I'm going to go to solid view so it's a little bit faster. And I'm also going to go to the modifiers tab and add an ocean modifier. So what you get by default is this sort of a large wavy piece. Let's adjust some of the settings so it looks more appropriate for the size that we have. So the first setting that I want to change is the resolution. So this will sort of determine how much detail is in the wave. For my purposes, 12 will work fine. Change it for both the viewport and the render. The next thing you want to change is the spectrum. So by default, it's set to turbulent ocean. We are not simulating an ocean here. We are simulating a pool. And so if you select shallow water, you'll get something that's a lot closer to it. One of the last things that we have to change is the size of the waves and sort of the overall scale because it's a bit large. So I'm just going to reposition a little bit using G and scale it down maybe a little bit. And next I just want to play with the wave scale. So by default it's set to 1. These waves are a bit too choppy for this pool. So I'm going to put it down to like something like 0.2. And then move it up a little bit further so it's closer to the edge of the pool. And that's pretty much it. That is all you really need for a basic water mesh. So what we have to do next is add a shader for our water. So I'm going to go into the shading tab and create a new material. I'm going to label that pool water. And I'm going to get rid of this matte material and I'm going to add a glass material and I'm going to plug that into the output. And the only other node that I need is a clear volume. So I'm going to search for volume clear. I'm going to plug that into the interior volume. So there are just a few settings that we need to change here in order to make it work. So let's zoom in here and let's change the IOR of this clear volume. And the IOR is the index of refraction, which determines how light passes through the volume. And for water, that is 1.33. Next, you have the absorption color, which is basically the color of your water. So we're going to choose something something around here. Looks a little blue, a little cyan, a little green. That is something that you can play with. And lastly, we have the absorption depth, which, as the tooltip says, the depth at which white light is turned into the absorption color. So this is sort of how you get the effect where in shallow parts of the water, it is more clear. And as it gets deeper, it'll get more and more like your absorption color. So I'm just going to put 4 meters. That's just a rough approximation based on how deep this pool is. That's another setting that you can kind of play with. But that's pretty much it. You can go into rendered view and see what your pool water looks like. And it's looking pretty good. All right, so we have our basic water shader, but we're not quite done yet. To continue, I'm just going to add a camera so we can get a consistent view of what we're working on. So I'm going to go back into the layout tab and I'm going to add a camera. I'm going to zero out the rotation so it's facing downwards. Move it up. And maybe to angle it a little bit, maybe 30 degrees. And move it the Y direction and maybe over here. See what this looks like in rendered view. All right, this will be a pretty good frame for what we're working on. The last setting that I want to enable on the camera is auto brightness. So if you go into your camera settings over here, under the image pipeline tab, you have this tone mapper, and I'm just going to select auto brightness. And basically what that does is automatically exposes your scene correctly. So the highlights won't be blown out and your shadows won't be too dark either. The next thing that we want to do is enable our caustics. So to do that, you go into your render properties. Under the caches tab, there's a photon GI cache. You're going to enable that. We're going to disable the indirect light cache because we don't have a lot of indirect light in the scene. And let's enable the caustic light cache. So a couple settings to change here. We probably don't need 20 million photons. Probably do it with 2. And the other 2 settings you want to change are the lookup radius. So this is sort of the width and sharpness of the caustics. By default, it's a bit too thick for what we're looking for. So we're going to change this to 0.004. And we're going to change the minimum radius to 0.001. And with that, you should have caustics when you hit render. So if you're looking to create a still image, you can basically stop here. There are a couple last settings that I would recommend. One is enabling the denoiser. So the default denoiser that comes with LuxCore is pretty good. And the other thing that you might want to do is add a halt condition. So if you're unfamiliar with LuxCore, LuxCore by default will render indefinitely. So in order to have it stop at a certain point, you have to enable a halt condition. So I'm going to enable that. And for this, I'm going to use samples. And to get a decent image for this one, you're going to want something around 300. And you can just hit F12 normally to let that render. If you're wondering how to access the denoise version of your render, go up to where it says combined and change that to denoised. So the final phase of this tutorial is animating the water and having it loop perfectly. And the way that I'm going to do that is with another ocean modifier. But before we do that, let's just make sure that our animation settings are correct. So right now we have it 360 frames long. We only need it to be 30, as we need just 1 second of footage to loop perfectly. And then we'll also go into our output properties and make sure that our frame rate is set to 30 frames per second. Now let's go back to our water. Go back into the modifiers tab, and let's duplicate this ocean modifier. And let's just change the geometry from generate to displace. So there are 2 properties on the modifiers that we want to animate. The first one is time. So if you play with the setting, you can kind of see the water move, and that's kind of what we're going for. So we're going to make sure that we are on frame 0. And let's insert a keyframe by right-clicking and hit insert keyframe when time is at a value of 1. And let's also insert a keyframe on the wave scale. Next, let's go to the last frame, so frame 30, and let's change the time value to 2. right click, insert keyframe, change the scale to 0, right click, insert keyframe. Now we're basically going to do the inverse on the other one. So for this modifier, we are going to go back to frame 0. We are going to change the time from 1 to 0, right click, insert keyframe. Let's change the wave scale to 0, right click, insert keyframe. Then we'll go back to frame 30, change this to 1, right click, insert keyframe, and change the scale back to 0.2, insert keyframe. And that's it. If you hit play on the timeline, you will see that you have perfectly animating water. So the last thing that we have to do is render the sequence, and let's just make sure that we have our settings correct to do that. So I'm going to go into Output Properties, and under this file format you have PNG. So I am actually going to render an image sequence, but to show you, if you wanted to do a video without having to process it in After Effects or some other third-party program, you can change this to FFmpeg video. And I also recommend using this encoding preset of H.264 in MP4. That'll give you some decent results at a decent file size. But like I said, I'm going to use PNG here, as that will give me more control over the final output. So yeah, the other thing we have to change is the output folder. So right now it's in a temporary folder, but let's select a safer place to put this. So I'm going to put this in a render folder, and we'll call this sequence 8. I have a bunch of test renders from when I was making this tutorial. So I'm going to select a new folder, hit accept. So now all of the frames will go to that folder. The only other thing is that I want to save both render passes. So you have a raw render, which has no denoising, and then you have a denoised version. To save both of those, the way that I do it is using the compositing tab, select use nodes, and then you can search for file output. And then you just change this, and I'm going to make a new folder in here and just call it denoise. Select that, hit accept, and move the denoise pass into this file output. And from here, you can start rendering. So up here, you can go to render, render animation. So once you rendered out all the frames for your animation, which probably took a while, you'll get a folder that looks something like this. So this is the original folder that we rendered to. And in here we have the sequence that isn't denoised, which is pretty noisy. And then we also have the denoise pass in a separate folder. It looks a little smoother. So what we need to do now is take these frames and turn it into an animation. And the way that I'm going to do that is using After Effects. So I've created a new project in here already. There's no compositions. So what we need to do is import those frames. So to do that, you're going to double click on this left sidebar over here. And then you're going to go into the denoise pass, which is what we want to animate with, and select the first frame and make sure that PNG sequence is checked along with create composition. Once you have that, just hit import, and we've imported the footage and it is automatically animated. So if you hit the spacebar on your keyboard, you'll see your animation in action. There are two things that I want to do before I export this. The first is to add some temporal filtering, which is a fancy way of saying that I want to reduce the amount of flickering that we have in our animation. Part of the reason we need to do this is because of the auto brightness setting that we use in our camera, but also because we're bouncing light around in all different directions, which can cause the scene to be inconsistently lit. So to do that, I'm going to pause my animation real quick and go up into the Effects and Presets panel and search for Grain. And you have this remove grain option. So I'm going to drag that onto our footage. And in your effects control panel, you'll see this panel here. So I don't actually want to remove grain, which is the primary function of this effect. So to do that, I'm going to go into the noise reduction settings and change this from 1 to 0. But what I do want to enable is this temporal filtering here. So I'm just going to click this checkbox to enable it. and it will give you a little preview box to show what it's doing. So you can use that to kind of understand what's happening, and you can move it around with this preview region here, and you can adjust this to kind of see what you're changing. So in this little box, you can see it's a lot less flickery, which is exactly what we want. So to apply that for the entire frame, change the viewing mode from preview to final output. So if you try to play it now, it'll take some time to calculate all the different frames. But once you do that, you can see it's much less flickery and it's a lot nicer. So the only other thing that I wanted to do is increase the amount of times that this is going to loop. If you want to upload this to a place like Instagram, you need at least 3 seconds of footage, and right now we only have 1. So the quick way to do this is to right click on your footage or the image sequence that we had and go to interpret footage and then main. And under other options, you have this loop counter. So by default, it's looped 1 time. You could change this to be 10 or looping 10 times. But currently our composition only is 1 second long, so we have to change our composition setting as well. So to do that, you can either do Control or Command K, or go up to Composition and go to Composition Settings. Under duration, change this from 1 second to 10 seconds. And then if you stretch our little time bar out, you can see that our composition is now 10 seconds long. Now we just need to drag this composition handle so that it goes the full 10 seconds. And now you have 10 seconds of looped footage. So all that's left for us to do is export this footage. And the way that I do that is go up to Composition, add to Adobe Media Encoder Queue, which will open up Media Encoder. And you will have this entry here in your queue. And the only thing that you might want to change is I'm just going to disable audio. It just reduces the file size ever so slightly because we don't have audio in this composition. And the default settings for this should be pretty good. You can play with the bitrate to kind of adjust your estimated file size. Right now, I'm not too concerned. For Instagram, you want to be less than 30 megs. I'm just going to hit OK. Once you're done with that, hit play, and it will render that out. Great, so once it's done rendering, you can click on this output location to show where it is. This is our final animation. All right, that's it. Thanks for watching, everyone. This is the same technique that I use in all of my animated pool renders, so I hope you enjoyed. And let me know what you think in the comments below. I will see you in the next one.